Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Alim Jhaveri. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the All India Professionals Congress, and I'd like to welcome you to a wonderful conversation this Saturday night. We have with us today two of our most eminent, brightest, and most effective practitioners of public policy. We have Professor Rajeev Gowda, former Member of Parliament, head of the Indian National Congress's research cell. We have Mr. Amitabh Dubey, President AIPC Delhi and President of and the Policy Coordinator of the All India Professionals Congress. Today, we're going to discuss one of the most important issues, COVID-19 management, what went wrong and how to fix it. My colleague Nikita and I are here to just facilitate this conversation, but it will be between Professor Rajeev Gowda and Amitabh Dubey. There will first be a conversation between the two of them, and then we will take a few questions from the audience. We will initiate that a little later on in this conversation. But before we begin, we wanted to just draw your attention to a couple of housekeeping rules. This conversation will be for 1 hour. We will have a Q&A session we'll have a conversation with Amitabh and Professor Rajeev Gowda, and then a conversation with the audience. When that conversation with the audience begins, we will inform you of that. Please keep your questions brief and to the point so that we can take as many questions as possible. But other than that, once again, welcome. Amitabh Dubey, my colleague and friend, I hand over to you.
Thanks, Alim. It's a pleasure to be here with someone as, someone I've worked closely with, Professor Rajeev Gowda, who he and I worked together on the 2019 Congress Manifesto, which we cannot be held responsible, I think, for the election result, but I think everyone agreed that the document was very well prepared. There were some fantastic ideas in it, and it was a real pleasure working with him on that. So, Professor Gowda, this white paper is actually, it's a very impressive document. I've been reading through it in some detail. A lot of people say that, the opposition spends a lot of time criticizing the government. Where are the productive ideas that the opposition has to offer? Well, I say to these people that this white paper is where you will find these productive ideas. There's a very strong critique of government policies. There's a good analysis of, based on data, what went wrong, how we could have done better. And there are concrete suggestions for the government to follow. So, the question then arises is that while we're in a crisis and currently we are in a sort of interregnum between different waves, hopefully the next wave, whenever it happens, will not be as devastating and damaging as the last one. But the question is, why present a white paper at all? What would you have to say about that?
See, Amitabh, first, thank you so much for your kind words during your introduction. It was a pleasure working together with you, and it continues to be a pleasure working together with you, Alim, and the overall Congress ecosystem. And we look forward to better times, both for the party and for the nation when it comes to healthcare and other outcomes. Well, why do we need a white paper? Look at the basic approach that the Congress party has had right from the beginning. Right? Rahul Gandhi warned the government, and the warning was not, in some kind of a negative tone. It was a very constructive warning saying, hey, pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world and take the necessary steps to protect our country and our people. And that's been the spirit of Mr. Gandhi's interventions throughout. The Congress party, if you actually look at the white paper document, is about 150 pages long. The actual original content, in terms of the white paper, is about 100 pages. The remaining 50 pages constitute statements by the Congress Working Committee, letters written by Dr. Manmohan Singh, Srimati Sonia Gandhi, Rahul Gandhi, and others to the Prime Minister and to the government with constructive suggestions throughout. Okay, so basically our approach throughout has been, look, we are in this together as a nation. We are all in this together across party lines. Let's put our minds and hearts together and make the best possible difference to how COVID is managed. And we have not got that kind of response at all from the government, but that hasn't stopped us from producing a paper, a very detailed report, which is what the white paper really is, which actually looks at both what has gone wrong and also says this is what you should have done and this is what you still need to do to fix things and to prevent the third wave or to be able to manage it better and even future waves. The basic spirit is constructive. Criticism is still constructive. And actually, the criticism is very required at this point in time because the government's approach has been to act as if this is all some mega PR exercise. Okay, it's all focused on image and managing headlines and things like that. And it's incredibly important in these times when even the media doesn't record their criticisms aggressively enough, when there are institutions that are not really, playing a proactive part in terms of identifying what's gone wrong and what needs to be, just placed on record, right? So this is a document which is serious and long, partly because it is like an independent commission's, report on what happened over the last 18 months. Okay, so that's what the purpose is. But the purpose is constructive, and it aims to get the nation on the move once again in the best possible manner.
Right. So what I liked about the report was, as you said, it's 100 pages of analysis. It's quite detailed. It both covers, and your point is right about the media not having picked up this report. I think this report is a very valuable resource because what it does is it takes things we sort of know and it provides a very coherent narrative, a chronological and thematic narrative about what happened, but it also delves into things that many people don't know. And I want to get into some of those things as well. But just to start at the beginning, our early response. As you said, former president of the party, Rahul Gandhi, had warned the government. The government didn't take it seriously. He warned it about COVID and also about the economic effects that were going to come. About a month later, he warned of a tsunami that was coming that would devastate the economy. And as usual, the government sort of either made fun of him or ignored it or whatever. And that's exactly what turned out. And one of the themes that comes out is how, the opposition, in fact, was predicting government actions, because every time we'd say do something, they'd attack us, insult us, and then, a week later, they'd implement that very policy. So what do you think went wrong in the initial phase? Why did we miss the first opportunity to shut down? Perhaps we would not have succeeded completely because so many countries still had to deal with this wave, but perhaps we would have reduced the impact. So what went wrong in the early stages, in your opinion? And what should we have done differently?
Okay, see, the government started paying attention, but they prioritized politics, for example, over actual response to the pandemic, right? I remember standing up in the Rajya Sabha and basically urging the government to shut Parliament down fast because, we were asking the whole country to be very careful about social distancing. And here we were, a lot of older people mingling, but the government refused to listen because they were waiting to topple the Madhya Pradesh Congress government, right? Only after that was done did they actually make a move in terms of, not just shutting down Parliament, but also imposing a nationwide lockdown, right? Now, many of these things, the nationwide lockdown, for example, could have been done in a manner which was much better planned, right? If you had given, at that point in time, you could count the number of cases, literally, I wouldn't say on your hands, but there were very few cases, positive, people who were tested positive within India. And so the vast majority of the population could have been given a chance to go back home without actually spreading the virus at that stage of the pandemic within India. All right. So that they did not do, and they just chose this, as usual, sudden shock and awe kind of approach. And in the process, we saw this sight of migrant workers and their families trudging, thousands of kilometers back home. And, and all of us were really, I mean, the one good thing that the Congress Party did is we offered to transport people back. We offered to pay for their passage back. And we certainly demonstrated a lot more heart than the government did. Okay, so that's one dimension. The other, it has to do with keeping the virus from entering India, right? So we saw in the early days that yes, it started in Wuhan, and we started sort of putting various kinds of restrictions on people coming from China and that region, but we were reading stories about, for example, Italy's healthcare system being overwhelmed, right? So when we knew that it was already a mega outbreak in Europe, for example, why didn't we pay attention to those passengers? Why didn't we pay attention to those people who tested positive without a travel history? I mean, the scientists basically argue that in the early days, if we had paid better attention to both people at airports and those who are otherwise tested positive, and those what we call the three T's, right? Testing, tracing, and treating. These are the three main agendas that needed to be implemented at at a nationwide level with tremendous seriousness. And it's not like India did not know this, because we had seen Kerala when it was faced with the Nipah virus. They had actually gone through these sort of measures, and that's exactly what would have been very, very helpful to do at the national scale. But somehow I think there was a sense of we're not quite sure what's emerging, or there was a tendency to ignore the scientists. Okay, I mean, let me point out that the scientists are also updating their knowledge as things evolve. But there were enough pointers from them, for example, that the lockdown was unnecessary at that point in the manner in which it was imposed, right? So basically that's that. And then if you think about what also happened around that time, there was a communalization, right? There was an outbreak with the Tablighi Jamaat, and that became the point of news shows and conversations, and the government went berserk trying to paint this virus in communal colors. And we are paying the price for that. And of course, the government got chastised by the courts for going after. Nobody's saying that there wasn't an outbreak there, but the kind of response was just terrible.
Yeah, you mentioned, I was going to bring it up a little later, but since you mentioned it, one of the things that comes out in the report is how the government's control of various institutions contributed to a suboptimal response. And we can, Niti Aayog or other institutions. But one of the puzzling things for many people is the institutions that chose to consult in this strategy building. And I'm not talking about Patanjali and Baba Ramdev. I'm talking about, for instance, the ICMR. The ICMR is a research institution, and you clearly bring that out in the report, whereas we actually have bodies. We have the we have other bodies that were set up to do this. We have epidemiologists. We have lots of epidemiologists, but apparently they were not really brought into the picture. And we had, a doctor who's a pediatrician being one of the people leading this effort, and other such things, which is not to say a doctor's input is not important, but surely an epidemiologist is necessary during an epidemic. So what explains INSACOG? We can talk about INSACOG and gene sequencing for the new variants. What explains what the government did, and what were the consequences of these decisions, in your opinion?
So that's a very profound question, because this strikes at the heart of institutional structures that need to be in place to manage pandemics, right? It's not as if we have not faced epidemics, at least earlier. And so we have a National Institute of Virology. We have our, the National Center for Disease Control, right? So these are centers that have had a long history of going into the field and literally making sure that every last last patient is identified, isolated, treated, and and various viral outbreaks are actually brought to a closure. Okay, so we did have that sort of example, and then as I mentioned to you, Kerala, we had the states example from a fairly recent from a recent time. Now, part of it is, I think, the tendency to go after maybe the circle that on a regular basis or something like that. Okay, so that could have happened here, where even the pediatricians and the other people brought on are eminent in their own domain. It's just that they may not be the most appropriate for what we were trying to achieve here. And there was a case where, for example, there were IIT Kanpur professors involved in making projections, and other epidemiologists were saying, hey, these guys were not necessarily in touch with the epidemiological science, and therefore were making predictions that were not accurate either. So I think part of this is we needed right up front, as soon as, see, the crazy thing is that India actually had, you could say, 2 months advance notice, right? December 31st is when WHO announced that something had happened in Wuhan and this was going to be spreading. Before this became a big deal in India, we had January and February, during which we saw Europe dealing with this. We saw America dealing with this, Britain dealing with this, right? Okay, so we had those 2 months where we could have actually, brought people together and decided what are the institutional mechanisms that we're going to put in place to get the best expertise together. And so we did create multiple task forces. Not all of them met in the same, or were given the same kind of importance. And so a lot of this is, sort of bureaucratic bungling, possibly. But we're paying a heavy price for that. The other is, there's, I think, a culture that has developed within India, within the government, within the media, even within judicial bodies, of not questioning enough, right? Okay, so if someone says, yeah, this is what the PMO has decided, everyone says, oh, okay, the PMO is all-knowing and of course all-powerful, so we better, better listen to what they're saying and let's not raise our voice, right? A couple of scientists actually ended up, the scientist from Ashoka,
Shahid Jamil.
Shahid Jamil resigned. Gagandeep Kang, who is a fellow of the Royal Society, an eminent virologist, she resigned. I mean, basically later on in the process. But these are not people who would make those kinds of decisions during a crisis if they felt that they were being listened to, that they had a voice that was, respected. So I would say that, that this is one of the big failures, that not harnessing the science and the science establishments in the best possible manner. Okay. And you mentioned ICMR, right? ICMR is a revolution. The other two that I mentioned are the ones that are in the field. They are the organizations for outbreaks.
While this was going on, perhaps future of an investigation by some journalist. This institutional structure, we've sort of been talking about the first wave, but it became, particularly these problems became quite devastating in the second wave, because as you mentioned, the COVID-19 task force didn't even meet in February and March 21. And the COVID genetic sequencing committee, or the committee in charge of that, warned of what became the Delta variant, which is now devastating Africa most recently, and I think in other parts of Asia also, and other countries. They warned, and there was 2 weeks, there was no response to their findings. And this was a finding that came after a very inactive genetic program to begin with. So they actually had a finding that was important, and they were ignored. So this seems to be, and the reasons maybe, you know, we can dwell on the reasons, you know, the elections in 5 states and, you know, Kumbh Mela and so on and so forth, which probably we should also talk about, although it is well traveled in a way, but I think it's important to put it into a narrative where we see step by step what went wrong. So I guess the question is, perhaps the story will come out someday of exactly what happened. It has come out to some extent in the media of why we didn't do it. But it seems that this, in a top-down, this is again my reading, and I'd be interested in your opinion, this very top-down process you described, PMO driving things and key officials driving things, it means that the priorities of the moment are what get accommodated. So if the priority is winning elections in 5 states, if the priority is making sure that you don't upset religious people and you have a huge Kumbh Mela, even though it's actually bad for the people who are going there, it's going to harm them, then that's what happens, and science is put by the side. How do you feel? Is that a correct reading? What do you have to say about the way the government took these inputs and converted them into policy?
See, there's something else that was driving this, and that is a sense of hubris, a sense of overconfidence that came after the first wave, right? See, one of the things that's an unfortunate problem both in the first and second wave is that there's massive underreporting and undercounting. Okay, we can discuss that separately. But when the wave sort of petered out, the BJP National Committee basically, congratulated the Prime Minister on defeating COVID, and he made the announcement in a Davos conference as well, saying that we can teach the world a lesson on how to manage these things. And so that overconfidence carried forward over the next few months to a sense of invulnerability. The basic notion that, okay, we are Indian, we're special, and nothing is going to happen to us. And that's when the political agendas became even more prominent in their thinking, right? 8 phases for an election in Bengal, which is about the same size as Tamil Nadu, okay, just a little bigger, okay, and all aimed at conquering that what turned out to be impregnable fortress. But the point is, even with the Kumbh Mela, there were people who argued that this was not the right thing to do at this point in time. Now, we've not got into that dimension. We've basically said the Prime Minister and the Chief Minister of Uttarakhand invited people and said, okay, this is going to be safe. We're going to have people tested, and we're going to make sure that appropriate measures are maintained so that pilgrims are protected. But none of that actually happened on the ground. And we've seen the scandals about the testing, the rackets and the scams with regard to testing that have taken place. And the sad part is that people who came there as pilgrims went back to different parts of India, and therefore the virus spread much more deeply into the hinterland than it needed, than it could have otherwise. So those sorts of things. Election rallies you saw were massive exercises, and people were all jostling with one another. And there are multiple rallies at which the Prime Minister, the Home Minister, Amit Shah, and others, we did not wear masks. Okay, so now the thing is, there's this other feature about what's called risk communication, right? The Prime Minister is supposed to be a master communicator. One of the key things that he needs to do was also to continuously communicate to the people and say, do not do this, do not do that. Instead, he was basically saying, wow, what a wonderful crowd. I've never seen something this large before, right? And so the signals emanating from the top, from a person who people still believe in, were very mixed. And as a result, a lot of people let their guard down, and some fraction of them paid the price. Okay, but it's politics over science. That's the real real problem. And there's an angle out there with the Delta variant as well. It emerged in Amravati district of Maharashtra, and the government has had this attitude of, Maharashtra, we need to bring down that government somehow, and let's paint them in the worst possible light. So instead of being supportive, you would see union ministers trying to attack the Maharashtra government in vicious ways. Actually, vicious is the term that would apply to multiple ministers and their communications throughout this whole pandemic. When everyone says, let's work together, all you get is, oh, you're an agent of some, you're paid by some lobbyists or something like that. Crazy stuff.
Yeah. So one very striking number was that Uttarakhand, after the Kumbh Mela, had an 1800% increase in cases. That is, that's pretty clear connection there. Other states were not having that experience. Why those numbers? Excess deaths. We've seen some suggestive figures at Madhya Pradesh. The deaths are 42 times what was reported. Gujarat 11 times. UP Bihar could be anywhere between 3 and 30 times. So I guess you can't really politically, like from a propaganda point of view, you can cover up deaths, but the people see what the actual death rate is experienced by the people, right? So you can't really cover that up. So I guess we'll find out soon enough what the people of India think about the experience they went through. I don't know if you...
If I may jump in here. Actually, a lot of basically, attributed, these are things that I'm reading in the papers. I obviously don't have first-hand knowledge. Attributed those deaths, those massive excess deaths to, a person had fever and passed away, right? It's just bukhar, something like that. You're not associating it with COVID necessarily, all right? Now, one of our recommendations, which, which now the Supreme Court has been asserting, is that, has reiterated or is making a separate parallel point, is saying that, look, the government must pay 4 lakhs compensation to every COVID victim, right? So now a large number of people may say, hey, I think our family member died of COVID, but the authorities never registered it that way. And therefore we are being cheated out of our, what should have been given to us, especially in this hour of need. Okay. So I think if the Supreme Court order, sort of gets implemented, then you will see more, basically engagement with this issue, in a way that can lead to a lot more anger, a lot more, sort of reaction, which so far we haven't seen, because everyone's just, their lives are shattered, their livelihoods are affected, and they're just trying to cope, right? And there's a government that's not being helpful, in terms of recognizing these sorts of statistics. I mean, the government has not been, following what WHO suggests should be the way of counting COVID-related deaths. Okay.
So, I think the big topic we haven't yet covered in the report, and one that matters a lot these days, is vaccines. Both the vaccine management. The government has been trying to defend itself by accusing the Congress party of promoting vaccine hesitancy. When in fact, what the numbers show is that the states run by the Congress and its allies have done better in terms of vaccination, at least the last time I saw the figures, than the BJP-run states. And in fact, even other party-run states have done better than the BJP-run states. So, that's something to take note. Hopefully, everyone catches up eventually. There's a couple of elements. One is it's well known, but the surprising indecision on ordering vaccines in a timely manner. And it wasn't just the OECD countries, the rich and powerful countries who are funding the vaccines, grabbing it. I think in your report, I saw that Brazil had ordered 9 crore vaccines, and Brazil's population, albeit big, is a fraction of ours, back in October or much before us. And we only began ordering in January, and we were quite lackadaisical for a long time. In August 2020, Brazil had ordered. So, not in October, August. Serum Institute said on the record that they don't have any orders. So, there is that story. It's well known, but it still shocks me when you think about it. And, having a fake world record for one day, followed by a world record in, the negative delta in vaccinations, perhaps, perhaps it works for PR, but it certainly doesn't solve the problem. The other part that I found interesting in your report, again, to some extent it's understood, but it brought it out very clearly, was the differential treatment of different vaccines. Pfizer and Sputnik are told, we need bridging trials. Whereas Bharat Biotech is told, go right ahead, we'll worry about the third stage data afterwards. And fortunately, the data has now come out. It seems to be okay, but that is still a risk we took. So what explains this very strange championing of some vaccines and companies, not of others? And is that connected to our lack of timely orders, in your opinion?
So again, it's related to the politics of a lot of this, right? Why do you mentioned vaccine hesitancy and the accusations against the Congress? Now, those rest on two simple things. One, a handful of tweets by some of our senior leaders, former union ministers, basically saying, hey, you seem to have fast-tracked Bharat Biotech without the third phase trials, that is on human subjects, being available. Why are you doing that? You don't need to do that, right? But why did you do that? Because you wanted to say we are Atmanirbhar Bharat, and therefore we've been able to do something indigenously. There's no need to do that. It doesn't matter where the vaccines come from as long as they do their job of protecting people, right? But then when Pfizer comes in and says we are ready to come in and do some contract production in India, the government says, the health minister, who is a very experienced, what shall we say, leader in terms of responding to crises of this sort, or at least in the context of vaccinations, basically gave the signal that we don't need Pfizer, and we're going to make you run through the hoops again when Pfizer is already been tested and and sort of rolled out in other countries. See, this was all not necessary at all, and we missed out. Okay, and then there was this whole drama about vaccine Maitri, right? Where
Yes.
the foreign minister Shankar basically went overboard trying to promote the prime minister as this great benefactor of the world. And when it started to, when India started to see the situation worsening, and people started raising the question of why are you exporting vaccines when we need vaccines here, then they said, oh, well, actually, many of these were contracted and were part of private deals with Serum Institute. Okay, then what's this whole drama about being the benefactor of the world, right? Okay, and so this sort of stuff. So the consistent pattern of playing to the gallery, playing to the headlines, wanting to turn this not into a serious management of a mega, once in a century kind of crisis, but more into how can we manage the headlines and the shows and convince the people that we are the best thing since sliced bread, right? So that's been the basic pattern. And and the vaccine story, recently, literally a week ago, the government filed an affidavit in the Supreme Court. Okay, there it has revised all those numbers that it pushed out in the first place. Okay, originally they said 200 plus crore vaccines will be ready and distributed, administered by the end of this calendar year. Then suddenly in the affidavit, the numbers are revised, and it suddenly becomes just enough to vaccinate the number of people we have. But if you go deeper into that story, you'll discover that the assumptions are heroic. Many of these, for example, Bharat Biotech, the amount that's associated with Bharat Biotech is not going to be feasible to produce by Bharat Biotech or even other public sector undertakings, because it's a complicated process. It takes 3-4 months before the whole process results in actually an actual vaccines coming out and to be ready for administration. So once again, they're pulling a fast one. And this is what I don't understand. They did this in the Supreme Court during the migrant crisis, right? What did they say? There are no migrants on the street. They've all been taken care of. That sort of thing. Why are you lying? Face the facts, face the problem, and and we are there with you, and we'll work together to address it. But it's all this sort of thing. And Ravi Shankar Prasad, right? When Rahul Gandhi basically said, come on, take a chance on all these other vaccines that other countries are implementing, his immediate reaction was, oh, he's a lobbyist for other firms, right? Okay. And then to a handful of days later, the government provides, approves all of them. Oh, did the lobbyists, contribute to the government, to Mr. Prasad, for him to change his mind? What's the story here? Why vitiate the atmosphere with such vicious language when people are basically making constructive suggestions? That's what I don't get. Yeah.
I mean, clearly to demonize the opposition. And I think the key data point for them is not what they put in front of the Honorable Supreme Court or other government bodies, but what they put on WhatsApp, using their information dominance, which is how I suppose they manage to get away with some of these things, but that's a different debate. One last thing, I think we've close to the time we had allotted for our our bilateral conversation, is and this is where the Congress Party has a very distinct view, is the economic policies that would support, because obviously the secondary impact of the pandemic was economic devastation, both from the lockdown and the subsequent partial lockdowns and the general uncertainty that consumers and workers have been going through. So in brief, what is distinct about the Congress Party's approach to the economy, contrasting with what the government has done so far?
Well, the one thing that the historical track record would demonstrate is that the BJP NDA governments are incompetent. They are, they will take a flourishing economy and devastate it. Okay, we've seen that in the last few years. Mr. Modi may have 1-2 massive mandates, but he's basically squandered those on, some ideological agendas. And even before the pandemic hit us, we saw that the economic growth in this country was sliding, downwards on a continuous basis, down to 4%, before the pandemic hit us, right? GDP growth from, and the tragedy is that they will keep revising numbers to and fudging data to try and convey some other impression. Anyway, what have they chosen to do in terms of responding to this crisis and the extraordinary pain that the people of India are going through, even economically, right? Atmanirbhar package. The Prime Minister announces some big numbers. The record package, the highest in the world, right? The Finance Minister and her junior will explain over the next 5 days. Well, it turns out to be, and for a change, you saw all the ratings agencies and the investment banks all saying, hey, sorry, this is not even 10% of what you're announcing, right? Even a couple of days ago, the finance minister announced a whole series of credit packages, right? Okay, now, all of these are nice, but if you're struggling to survive, to keep your factory open or your shop open, are you going to be in the business of borrowing? Okay, are you going to say, okay, I'm about to shut down and here I am going to take on more debt? That's not going to, have the same impact. And what did we say? Look, just, increase Manrega, sort of allocations, and that is something that they have done. Provide more, sort of free rations and food supplies to everybody and don't link it to Aadhaar, don't link it to ration cards. Those who can afford not to get it will not go out there and, rip you off. But more than that, we also said this is the time to, put some money in people's pockets because there's a demand slump. At one level, if you want the economy to revive, you need to see people spending, right? And that is one thing that we basically, we're not fiscally irresponsible, but we know that in these sort of circumstances, this is what's required right now. Okay, put money in people's pockets and let them, and let them spend, and in a Keynesian sort of multiply impact. Let's see the economy pick up and move forward. But we haven't seen those kinds of measures. Initially, there was some argument that the government is keeping its powder dry in case of future, future waves. But we've not seen, there are big PM Cares fund. What's being done with that, right? I mean, we're not. That's another very opaque, fund out there. So we're not seeing the kinds of economic interventions that would make a huge difference. And the cost is, you're seeing in terms of jobs lost, right? We've never seen this kind of unemployment numbers before. We've also not seen this kind of, people are eating less. Nutritional intake is falling considerably, right? So people are sick, people are undernourished, maybe children and, girls maybe worse off, what's going on, right? And these are all the consequences of a government that lacks empathy, that has resources. They're certainly taking it out of our petrol and diesel cost, taxes. They have the resources, and they're not putting the resources in the hands of the poor. Okay, which is what would really turn things around. So this is where the Congress party would never have gone down this path.
I think the the sad thing is that a lot of people I know are losing hope. Certainly, when I was growing up, through the ups and downs, you had this view that India has a good future. It might be a temporary down. We had the 2008 crisis, but we're going to come out of it. Now I find that feeling is dissipating, and you see that in the fact that so many of our, I think 7,000 top business persons have become residents outside the country. I mean, that tells you something about the ease of doing business. Whatever the index manipulations you're doing, the fact that they're all voting with their feet. And I think it's going to take a lot of work to turn this around. And I think the government's policies during the pandemic, as clearly your white paper lays out, has not done anything to reverse and has probably accelerated this decline, both real and perceived. So
we haven't dealt, we've mainly focused on the public health dimension in the white paper, but I'm going to turn this into a book, and we will add a whole dimension on the economy. We'll also add a dimension on the federal aspects of pandemic. These are two
right. That's an important one. A lot of back and forth on that, so it'd be good to explore that. Yeah. Well, thank you, Alim. Should we move to the Q&A?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Professor Rajeev Gowda, Amitabh Dubey, for that insightful and inspiring conversation. Broad spectrum mismanagement seems to be the theme, so it is a time to end this reign of error. We are going to do a quick room reset today. This is India's COVID-19 management, what went wrong and how to fix it, with Professor Rajeev Gowda and Amitabh Dubey. We are discussing a white paper that was recently produced by the Congress Party, Professor Rajeev Gowda specifically. This white paper can be found on the website of the Indian National Congress in the section Media Press Releases. It's called the White Paper on Government of India's Mismanagement, Suggestions and Analysis. Right, now we're going to be taking in a few questions. We've enabled the feature to raise your hand. So if you'd like to raise your hand, we will come to you, elevate you, take your question. Request you to please keep your question brief and to the point. We have one question coming up.
Yes, Anand, pleasure to see you. Well, see, there is many different ways in which the party is responding. Right now, the document itself is being translated into Hindi, that much I know. And possibly we'll have to find ways of, it's a very, it's a detailed document. So maybe part of our job is to figure out how do we take the highlights of them, maybe, executive summary is about 5 pages, but, maybe a booklet which basically takes the key learnings and shares them across the country. And so that's certainly one part of what needs to be done. But the Congress is also planning to reach out to people who have lost family members and to ask, and to offer them some kind of support, emotional or otherwise. And so if we can do that job well on the field, right? I mean, there's a Prashnam survey that came out which said 1 in 6 people have actually lost somebody they know or to COVID. So this is a huge, huge problem in the country, and nobody's reaching out to them. And so that's one of the things that our party needs to do on the ground. But the communication, I do agree. There is a lot more that we need to or we can do about this. And let's brainstorm. Let's think about what else we can do to get the word out, right? See, yeah, the thing is, nobody is necessarily too excited about finger pointing at this point. They also want to figure out, okay, how, are we prepared for the future? Are we going to be, somehow, are we going, are we going to see, things are declining, right? Um, so I'm not sure. We'll have to do a little more brainstorming to figure out what should be the appropriate communication and outreach strategy. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. See, we have as a party done this on multiple occasions. At this point, we are competing with, petrol price rise. We are competing today with the Rafale scam developments in France. Yeah. But your article probably, well, let's figure out a way to, to get a version of that out in more mainstream newspapers. In Hindi, for example, Dainik Bhaskar was very proactive in covering the crisis, and maybe in other languages. So let's have an offline conversation on this, and we'll take this forward. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Anand, for your question. We are next going to Mr. Abhishek. And also, as always, if you could just keep your question brief. And once we've taken Abhishek's question, we have Dr. Vandana Singh. After her, we will look at some of the other requests for questions that are there. Go ahead, Abhishek.
So I got the point, Abhishek. So basically, yes, we have made this point that much more could have been done upfront. And, but there were reports, for example, when people were coming into Delhi, that there wasn't much proper testing that was done. And certainly the effort to quarantine and isolate, etc., was being applied only to select countries, when the matter of fact was that people were coming in infected from other parts of the world as well. So maybe we needed a much more aggressive quarantine and testing regime. And many people were being let off with just a simple temperature check, right? So, basically, so we didn't have the protocol figured out as well. So some of these were early mistakes which the government could easily have, could have put in more attention, paid more attention to, and that would have had a serious impact on how things spread later. Good evening, Manjari. Um, yeah. See, immediately the moment the white paper was released, our favorite spokesperson on the other side, Mr. Sambit Patra, did some kind of a press conference where he came up with his version of a white paper, and the whole argument is reduced to politics. Okay, now if you listen to Rahul Gandhi during the release of the white paper, that was not a politically combative press conference. It was a constructive press conference where he said, look, we are offering you these critiques and even more importantly, these suggestions on how to fix things. Okay? No? And so that, and we are amplifying the voice of experts that we've been speaking to. So don't treat this as some kind of negative political joust, right? But that's not what we get back from the other side. They're just innately programmed to treat any criticism as an attack, right? And that's just terrible that the nation, people of India, pay the price for that kind of an attitude. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Vipinji. Basically, on the economy, we had earlier produced a document that was circulated, in analyzing the government's response and its limited impact. But as far as the gap between the two doses of Covishield are concerned, the science, we're paying attention to the science, right? The first set of reports that were published said you need to expand the gap from 4 to 5 weeks to 8 weeks. And then there was another report which said, okay, do it up to 12 weeks. But that got changed and Britain started implementing a policy, especially in areas where the Delta variant had already kicked in, and lowered the time frame. But India, the policy has been a few months behind these scientific results, and as a result, you wonder whether the gap is driven more by availability of vaccines rather than the scientific results about when it would be most effective in terms of protecting people. So that's been part of the challenge, right? I mean, and then there've been other people who've been arguing that, look, you just give everybody at least a first shot, things like that. So why are we in this scarcity-driven decision making rather than a science-driven decision making? That is entirely due to the government and its and its mistakes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vipin, for your question. Dr. Tiwari, go ahead.
Yeah. So we will see that the issue would be absolutely raised, and there will probably be a special discussion in both houses about what went right and what went wrong. And it's in those contexts that our MPs will find this extremely useful. Okay, the white paper, and so let's see how well they use this material and how how well organized our parties are. I know that people in other parties have seen the white paper. Some of them have reached out to me. Some of my former colleagues in Parliament, in fact, have reached out to me saying that they've seen it and they're happy with it. So, but I think you're raising a very good point. We have two weeks, more or less, before the Parliament session starts. And I think we should work out a plan of action that would enable, say, if there is a discussion and if we have a set of speakers from the Congress, that each one of them is actually allocated maybe a chapter of the white paper to focus on, rather than each person saying the same thing. And that way, we'll be able to, enter into the record the very focused constructive criticism across all these lines. Yes, and this is, thank you. This is a very good reminder to think on those lines. Alim, please think about that for the Lok Sabha as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Dr. Tiwari, thank you so much. We know that you've been doing active COVID duty, so thank you so much, sir, for your service. Rishika, please go ahead.
Yeah, so the contrast, Rishika, comes from looking at what the government did at the central or union government level versus what had been very effective, for example, in Kerala, right? In Kerala, you had a decentralized approach, and that was also a result of Kerala's previous experience with handling the Nipah virus. You actually had, municipal corporation level, even village panchayat level, proactive measures. People actually going home to people and saying, just stay isolated. We'll take care of your food needs, and just make sure that you don't step out and infect anybody else. Who are your contacts, and the tracing. Because if you remember the initial some of the first patients who were quite super spreaders themselves, actually ended up being in Kerala. So a sort of a knowledgeable, empowered local body was able to do a tremendous amount in terms of last mile containment and response to the pandemic. Okay, so that's one dimension, right? But what the central government did was they decided that they'll use the Disaster Management Act. They will, centralize control and power. And there's certain things that the central government, the union government, should have done. For example, focused on vaccine procurement. Making sure that they have the resources, they have the scientific expertise and knowledge to be able to take a chance on, just like other countries did, saying, okay, let's get the vaccine manufacturing capabilities going up and things like that. But there was, I think, once more, a tendency to try and centralize for political gain, right? Okay, what the only face apart from the here, sort of the daily briefings or weekly briefings that you saw some officers doing, the only political face that you saw occasionally was the prime ministers, right? And so the whole story was the prime minister would be the savior of the country. But the savior disappeared when things started going badly. The savior reappeared when there was a when we seemed to have crossed the peak, right? Okay, so and in the process of centralizing, they ended up disempowering states. For everything, you had to look to the center, get its approval. Get one of our recommendations is if you are if you are still managing the vaccine process, distribution, please make your criteria clear of who's getting what and when. Okay, so that they can plan, and states can actually figure out who which areas or which districts need more immediately, things like that. And there hasn't been enough attention to all this. So this is the other side when we talk about the federal dimension of all this. The political motivations have had a negative impact on our ability to administer the vaccine in a manner that would address the problem better. See, remember that it's the same officers, the same IAS guys and the same officers at every level, including school teachers and others, who are adept at conducting elections, for example, right? I mean, they all come in, and in a short period of time, we end up conducting this mega democratic exercise. Similarly, we could have done something in terms of empowering a very decentralized structure to go out there and roll out the vaccine distribution, and also taking care of people. Remember, in Kerala and other places, even school kids were given supplies at home. There's been a nutrition problem because school kids haven't been going to school and getting their midday meals. So these are all problems that we will go into more detail in the next version of this in the book that we will produce. But these are all crucial dimensions. Needless centralization of of possibly the wrong things.
Thank you, Rishika, for your question. We're now going to go to Parag and then Pratik, and then we'll have to wind up because we are running a little late. So, Parag, if you could please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, well, thank you. We have focused on risk communication, and we've basically mentioned that the Prime Minister, since he's been, at a little bit at the forefront of all this, should have done a much more effective job of communicating, sort of behavioral messages, risk-related messages. And when I say risk, that's the scientific information. And there were crucial moments when the Prime Minister's own behavior led to the wrong signals being communicated to the people, for example, during the election rallies, right? And so this is actually something that's still extraordinarily important, because as the nation unlocks right now, you're beginning to see people dropping their guard. Even mask usage is not correct, not done right. And so basically, what you're suggesting is of crucial importance. And there's also this general sense that we may end up having to live with this for a much longer period of time, in which case these measures, right, which is social distancing, masks, and washing hands, and things like that, will absolutely need to be maintained on a continuous basis, because this is going to be in the in the air for a longer time. And that's something that the Prime Minister has the best pulpit out there, and is still a very credible communicator. So and may not want to share that limelight with maybe a senior scientist or something like that, the way Dr. Fauci played a role in America. But I must, before ending this, say congratulations to you and everyone like you who stepped up. People who volunteered, the NGOs, our own youth congress and its leaders. They filled a gap, a vacuum that had been left by a government that was inadequate in its response. So congratulations on the extraordinary work that you've all done.
Thank you, Parag, for your question. Could you go to Pratik, please?
Yeah, see, I think basically what we're seeing is a variety of reports, including ones that suggest that this threat was made. Okay, now fundamentally, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine has already been rolled out in different parts of the world, including in Britain and maybe elsewhere in Europe. And the Covishield vaccine that's produced by Serum Institute is essentially the same. So what we would have done is, made the scientific case for Covishield, which is the vast majority of Indian, vaccines that have been doses that have been administered as well. That needs to be granted permission, and then we would have given the results of Covaxin and basically shared that as well. I think it would just require a certain amount of scientific and diplomatic effort. This could have been prevented in the first place if we had anticipated this. There's no reason for Mr. Poonawalla to be playing the mega diplomat, either tweeting to President Biden or saying that I will reach out to the European authorities. It's something that the government of India needs to be at the forefront of. Okay, so I don't think we should have let it become such a politically charged mess. Okay, we would not have let it become that.
Thank you, Pratik, for your question. Before we conclude, gentlemen, could I request you for your final comments, starting with Amitabh?
Yeah, thanks, Alim. So, in conclusion, I had a wonderful conversation with Professor Gowda. I would urge all of you who haven't already done so to download the report. I think there's a link here somewhere. Certainly, we have put the link on Twitter under the Professionals Congress and Professor Gowda's handles. I urge you to read it. We have all been in the storm, and so we've all much of this information we have absorbed in little bits. Vaccines, we have opinions on a lot of these, but what the report does is it puts it together in a very coherent narrative that gives a big picture. It brings a lot of new information in, and it tells you a story of what went wrong and how it should have been done differently. So I would urge you all to read it, and I hope it's widely disseminated. And I'm sure the party will do the same. So thank you, Professor Gowda, for speaking with us this evening.
Thank you, Amitabh. It's been a pleasure. And let me reiterate that that document is based on us reaching out to experts, on us paying detailed and careful attention to how the whole crisis was reported. And so we've been able to address a large number of the issues. But as we said about undercounting of numbers and things like that, the crisis may be much, much worse than even we've captured. And I just hope that we will not see a repetition of the kind of devastation, the deaths that we saw during the second wave. I hope that the government will put in place measures that that will protect all of us, and that's their duty, and that's our hope.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Rajeev Gowda, Amitabh Dubey. For those of you who do not know or have not been there when we first joined, we're discussing an important report produced by the Indian National Congress by Professor Rajeev Gowda and his team. That report is available in its entirety on the website of the Indian National Congress. Links have been shared on AIPC, Professor Rajeev Gowda, and Amitabh's respective social media handles. Those of you who keep accusing the Congress of not having a plan, I suggest you to read page 89 onwards, section 10, titled The Way Ahead. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure as always. Both Professor Gowda and Amitabh Dubey have been committing themselves to the cause of progress for decades now, and it has been a privilege and a pleasure to have this conversation with them. Thank you for joining us on a Saturday night. If you haven't joined us already, www.profcongress.com, 123 process, and there's no paperwork. Good evening, good night, stay apart, and stay well. This conversation is now complete.